I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Hey. Before we start, I did want to acknowledge we had a loss in the D128 community. Our very dear, respected and treasured colleague, Carol Scoden, had a terrible loss this morning after a long illness. Her husband, Ray, passed away. So we hold Carol and her family in our hearts and in our thoughts. Carol was by his side when he passed this morning, but we want to wish the whole Scoden family our most sincere condolences. With that, we note that Casey Rooney and Jim Batson will be joining us, and we will get started with an invitation for public comment. We have anybody here wishing to address the board? Seeing none, going once. We'll move on to items for discussion. Oh my. I do not, but we certainly. I'm on the wrong committee meeting. Yeah. Momentito. We are at the Program and Personnel Committee meeting, where we will begin with the Equity Inclusion Action Plan presentation. We invite everybody to the podium to address the board.
You want me to share this one? Yeah.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm very proud to be here tonight to be one of the many presenters who will be sharing our action plan on equity and inclusion. And one of the reasons why I'm starting it off is because this is the third of 3 of our action plans. And so I'm setting the stage to remind the board of the work, the wonderful recommendations that came from the Health and Wellbeing Committee, as well as the Explore Multiple Paths team back in December. Knowing that that would be too long of a meeting to do all 3 in one meeting, we said, let's carry over this particular presentation. So this is the third of our 3 action plans. And similar to the presentations in December, we'll be focusing on the objectives, the things that the teachers and staff and administrators on the teams felt were the most actionable things that we could do, and then also how we're going to measure them. We are continuing to refine the more minute and detailed action plans, and we'll continue to make those available to the board. But for tonight's presentation, we're focusing on the objectives, what we hope to do, and how we hope to measure its effectiveness. And so I'm going to turn it over for a little history lesson.
Good evening. Dan, if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. So my name is Ann Singleton. I'm the equity coordinator here at LHS, and I'm also an English teacher. And I'm going to talk just a little bit, along with my colleague Tara, about our historical equity efforts. This timeline starts in 2019, but I do want to acknowledge the equity work has been happening in District 128 for many years before that. But as far as our timeline tonight, we started in with 2019, which is when equity work really became prioritized in District 128. That year, or that school year, school equity coordinators positions were established. The staff of color affinity groups were formed. We began participating in Courageous Conversation Protocol, and we had an equity focused institute day for staff, and that was in February of 2020. The following school year, 2020 to 2021, we embarked on equity research and exploration stage. We had optional professional learning opportunities offered throughout that year. They were all in virtual format, and we had many staff members who Zoomed in and participated with us. We had equity-based book studies that were conducted both with the whole district, at building leadership team meetings and in other spaces. We introduced culturally responsive education that year. The equity and inclusion survey was created, and I think the biggest moment that year, or thing that we created that year, was the Racial Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Board policy, policy 712, that was created and adopted that year, which I'm going to pass it to Tara to talk a little bit more about the following year. Yeah.
All right. Tara Young, as Ann mentioned, I'm the equity coordinator over at Vernon Hills High School. So in 2021, 2022 we continued our education of culturally responsive education with our staff, where we rolled out mandated culturally responsive education training for all teachers and actually all staff members as well. We offered equity related sessions at all of our institute days. Many of them were voluntary sessions that our staff attended. We began tracking the metrics that were established in the Racial Equity and Inclusion Policy 712. And then if you remember last year, we reported on and made action recommendations to the board for 4 of the commitments that our last year's district equity leadership team had identified as priorities. And this group here, the equity and inclusion identified as a district strategic goal, and that's what we're presenting on tonight. So this year, in 2022, 2023, we had the district director of equity and inclusion position established with the hiring of Mr. Barn. We hosted focus groups at both campuses and virtually for staff and students to help us develop our equity action plan. We gathered input from staff, again, through those focus groups and from staff surveys. And then we spent a lot of time this past fall establishing and developing the equity action plan that you are going to see tonight. And now I'm going to turn it over to Larry Barn.
Good evening. I'm Larry Barn, and I am the Director of Equity and Inclusion for District 128. I want to thank all of our strand leaders who are here with me tonight, presenting on our equity action plan. They have really done a lot of work, but I really want Ann and Tara to, this is my left and right hand, and they stand on both sides of me and they keep me from falling. And so they've really welcomed me into this district in order to do this work. But the fruits of our labor you'll see tonight really come from the individuals who are listed here. And the equity leadership team was formed before I even arrived. So they had been doing this work in part of creating the racial equity policy. They've been a part of the strategic action plan development, and now they're really focusing in on making sure that the strategic goal for equity and inclusion has a strong action plan. So these individuals played an integral part, and they represent an array of stakeholders within our district that include administrators, teachers, counselors, ESP, coaches, social workers, and just a huge gamut of individuals who truly care about making sure that all means all in District 128. And so our action plan is focused on 5 areas. These areas are considered the 5 strands of systemic equity, and each one is dependent on the other. They truly work together in order for us to achieve improvement in equitable practices as a district. Each one of these areas must work simultaneously. So all 5 have to have action plans and objectives in order to work in concert with one another for us as a district. The individuals who will be presenting to you are the strand leaders. The large group of district equity leadership team members were subdivided into these 5 subcommittees who created the action plans based on the objectives that you will see tonight. So you will hear from each one of those leaders, and then you'll be able to see how these work together, and also some overlap between the equity strategic goal as with our health and wellness and our multiple pathways goal. So our first is our systems strand, and that was led by our superintendent. The superintendent has to sit on the systems strand. It was a non-negotiable part of this work. And for various reasons that Dr. Herman will explain to you. So you'll see the connection there, but she will go over how her group works together and what objectives they came up with and measures.
Thank you so much. And again, I would have volunteered to be in this position as the chair of this system strand had it not been recommended by our outside facilitator, Dr. Yvette Duglier. So that's part of when she partners with a district, there's things that she knows really help a team function really well and to make sure it goes from ideas to implementation. And the idea of making sure there's buy-in from the superintendent to the administrators, to the teachers, to involving students. So she really made sure that we were firing at all cylinders. So one of the reasons why she feels strongly that all 5 components must have some action, again, not that you're doing a million things in each of these 5 areas, but that if you were just to do professional learning in isolation, or just to look at some of these systems issues and not have the other parts too, you would just be spinning in your place. So I had the opportunity to work with approximately 9 staff members from across both schools, and they volunteered to say, systems sounds interesting to me. And we identified probably 5 or 6 different objectives that we could have really saw as potential areas for improvement or growth within certain policies. Obviously, we'd already done a lot of work on our equity policy. So that might have been an obvious choice for us to start with. We felt we've already gone so far, and that there could have been some other things too. But what our team settled on was 2 particular strands. If you can go to the next slide. So the first one is to develop a budget process to equitably allocate resources. And you might recognize this because this is very similar to one of the commitments. I believe it's commitment 5. I don't have them all memorized, but we have already, as a district, said when we were developing our equity policy that we felt it important that we make sure we have structures in place that are looking at equitable allocations, that students are getting what they need, not that everyone gets the same, but that people get what they need to be successful. And so we felt that because that was an important part of our system and we had already identified it previously as something that was an essential component, we included it in this action plan as well. How we'll be measuring that it'll be pretty much through all of the different reports that Dan presents to us in our budget. We'll be having components that show what are the investment that we're making in equity, what are the investments that we're making in exploring multiple paths. We also will make sure that we have opportunities to disaggregate the budget in ways that we haven't done previously. So we feel really good about this particular action plan. The second objective is to audit and revise the course recommendation process. And again, this is a systems one. And because this has so many moving parts, this is working with our middle schools. This involves looking at test scores. This involves having teachers have like rubrics and other things that they're using to help make sure that their recommendations are bias-free. So this was one that we thought would have a big impact on our students, especially remembering the data we looked at last spring that looked at the disproportionality of some of our students in our striving learners courses and some of the other things. So based on our achievement gap and some of the enrollment patterns, we felt that systemically looking at what data are we using and what processes are we using to make sure kids are being placed in the most rigorous learning environment possible, and that we're setting them up for success. This also happens to correspond with the Accelerated Placement Act. That is a requirement. So one other thing that I think you'll hear throughout this is we tried to not just do things because they're required, but we tried to say these things are going to be required. Let's make sure that those are a part of this action plan. So it's not one more thing. So the Accelerated Placement Act requires us to have a new policy in place by July 1st. So we will have a team meeting this spring who will be looking at that particular process. So again, the systems team felt very, very positively about these two objectives. And we look forward to, answering any of your questions at the end or sharing some of the more detailed action plans. And next, I think I'm turning it over to Yesenia Sanchez.
Happy Monday back from break. I have the teaching and learning strand, and there was a group of us, around 14 people who met and worked on the strand. There is one objective for us. Dan, you can go to the next one. And I don't want you to think that we only have one, so it's not a lot of work, because it is actually a lot of work. And so we have the task of assessing the status of diversity and inclusion in all of our existing curriculum maps. And so we are going to start with the American Literature, US History, and American Studies courses. And so we're going to do this by developing an audit tool. We're going to use a tool that was provided to us by Dr. Dubiel, and also use a tool that was provided that she linked us to by the NYU Steinhardt College of Education, their culturally responsive curriculum scorecard. And so we are taking pieces of both of the tools to develop one that is going to be, that's going to lend itself well to the work here. And so in part of this process, we're going to work with the teachers of these courses. We're going to start with American Studies first, because it covers two disciplines, English and history. It's a required course, and it's also responsive to some of the information that was gathered in our focus groups, our student focus groups. A lot of them reference history courses or literature courses, and when we looked at the panorama question around inclusion, if they felt that there was inclusion and representation in their courses. And so from the development of this audit tool, we are going to then develop a tool that that'll be easy to use with other courses that are not as easily tied to inclusion, like driver's ed or a science course. And so that is a task that we will also be working on. And so we're going to start with these 3 courses, and then develop a schedule of when we're going to pull in the rest of the courses. And we'll start with the humanities. That'll give us time to develop the tool for the courses that don't necessarily are not as easy to tie to this work, to have it ready, hopefully by the beginning of next school year. And that is it. That is my one objective.
The strand leader for Student Voice, Culture, and Climate is Dr. Ellis Bowen, and she was unable to be here tonight, but I will share the work of her strand this evening. And so their objective that came out of it, there was a lot of overlap with this group between the work that this strand, Student Voice, Culture, and Climate, wanted to do and what the strategic goal of health and well-being was going to do. And so in order to separate some of that work out and allow health and well-being to take the lead on some parts of it, we selected this particular objective specifically for the equity piece as a starting point for what we want to do. And that was to increase student connectedness and a sense of belonging through extracurricular participation. This objective was selected based on the voice of the students that was collected from surveys and focus groups and through conversations with students. Belonging and connectedness is directly related to experiencing success in schools. And according to the CDC, school connectedness has long-lasting effects on health and well-being. Youth who feel connected at school are significantly less likely to experience health risks related to sexual health, substance abuse, violence, and mental health in adulthood. And so we wanted to ensure that all students experience a sense of belonging in our schools. In spring 2021, 51% of students expressed a strong sense of belonging to our schools through the Panorama Survey. Now that we have this baseline data, we are positioned to increase that number of students who feel connected to the school by exploring structural challenges that are preventing students from being more engaged, specifically with extracurricular activities. Because we understand that students who participate in extracurricular activities are more likely to feel connection to the school community. For this reason, we're seeking to provide more opportunities for all students to participate in a club or sport. As social beings, it is important for humans to make connections with one another, and our work through this strand will seek to discover common student interests and connect them with others, with other like-minded individuals within the school. Additionally, students are more invested in their academic success when they view the classroom as a supportive community of learners. Creating such welcoming and inclusive environments is essential for student belonging. And they will measure this work through the increased number of students who participate in extracurricular activities and through the Panorama survey response around the question asking, how much do you feel like you belong at this school? The next strand is professional learning, and that will be Tara Young and Ann Singleton.
Hi again. So we had a team of both teachers and administrators that were part of our professional learning group that we worked on 2 objectives. And I'm here to talk about the first one, and then Tara will talk about the second one. So our first one, the objective is to develop a continuum of systemic learning for all staff on equity and related paradigms. And we picked this because we know that research shows that one and done professional learning doesn't result in long-term change or growth. And Tara and I have had a lot of experience providing equity professional learning. And oftentimes in the feedback that we receive from staff who attended, they're like, okay, what's next? And we're like, right, we got to figure that out. And so this is something that as a team, as we had a lot of conversations about what professional learning looks like and what we need, it was we have to figure out and create what that learning experience is going to look like and what those next steps are, and create opportunities for people to enter where they are in their learning and grow where they need to. So this is something that will in some ways be similar to what we have for Marzano with like a rubric where people can self-evaluate and self-reflect, right? And of course, this isn't part of the evaluation, this is separate from that, but that same sort of idea of I'm going to figure out where I am and what I need, and then have those opportunities available and ready to go. So this is a pretty big undertaking as far as designing all of it. Our first steps really focus on just finding out what are other districts and organizations and businesses, what are they doing and how do they do their equity learning, and what can we create that'll work best to meet the needs of all of our staff, because that's one of the other challenges that we talked a lot about is sometimes our professional learning is really focused on just classroom teachers. So how do we make sure that it works for all of our staff members from our ESP who have so many important moments with students and situations all the way through building leadership and district leadership. So with this continuum, our measures to see if we've gotten there, our rubric to measure knowledge and implementation of those equity practices, observation data to continuously track implementation of equitable practices in classes, and a system to monitor staff growth along the equity and inclusion continuum. So ultimately, we hope to have that rubric and then all of the materials ready to go. So that way, by the time we're done, we're ready to launch into some really meaningful professional learning where staff have opportunities to choose and figure out where they fit best, and then grow from there, which in turn will then benefit all of our students. So I'm going to pass it over to Tara to talk about our other objective.
So the Equity Action Plan is an 18-month plan, and developing our equity professional learning continuum will take the next 18 months. Like Ann said, that's a really big undertaking to develop this continuum. One thing we heard from our student focus groups and our staff focus groups over and over again is that staff and students are experiencing identity-based microaggressions in our building right now, in the hallways, sometimes in the classrooms, in the locker rooms, on the playing fields. And that came through loud and clear to us. And so we felt as a team that there was a sense of urgency there. We didn't feel like we could wait for 18 months while this continuum was developed before implementing some sort of professional learning right now to address the microaggressions that our staff and students are experiencing, specifically our historically marginalized groups. And so our second objective for the professional learning strand is to develop and implement in all staff required professional development related to interrupting identity-based altercations and microaggressions. And so the exciting part of this particular objective is that we already have that in the works. So for our February Institute Day, Mr. Varn and Dr. Yvette Dubiel are going to be co-creating a session about how to identify, interrupt, and then repair the damage done from microaggressions that all staff will be receiving. We recognize, again, as Anne was saying, that we can't have professional learning in isolation. That's not what research supports. So whilst all staff will be getting that professional learning on microaggressions, that learning will also be then enveloped into the continuum that we are developing. So all new staff, when we go through the onboarding process, will receive that professional learning. The measures that we'll be using to make sure that we are achieving this objective is that we'll be ensuring that there's a common learning experience related to equity for all staff. And we'll also be looking for evidence of school-wide implementation of equity practices through decreased reports of unaddressed negative identity-based exchanges. So we are very excited that we get to kind of hit the ground running with this objective very soon. And now I am going to be handing it over to Mary, who will be talking about
Thank you. Good evening. Strand 5 is looking at family and community as agency. And the first step of our group's work was to look at our recent panorama survey data, which showed us that unrepresented parents do not feel as connected or engaged in our school community. And because all voices matter in District 128, we plan to make connections happen and make all parents feel heard. Starting with listening tours, which were sort of like focus groups, but what we want to do is go out into the community and meet the parents where they are. Whether it's churches, libraries, community centers, even Zoom meetings, if that were the case. We want to learn what they would like to experience and how they would like to be connected to their students' school. We want to know what they feel their barriers are. And we also want to know how we can help them learn to support their students at home and at school. So as you see there, I've already stated our objective is to communicate with the underrepresented families, and our measure will be increasing our engagement with them. And we will be training staff members to do their part on the listening tours, going out in the community and then looking at those responses that we receive. We will have translation available if that were needed in some instances. And we will also be looking at all underrepresented groups, and that could include parents of special education students, parents of LGBTQ+ students, anyone that is not normally engaged fully with our district. And I'm going to turn it over to Larry again.
And so the African proverb says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. I'm happy to have worked with the Strand leaders and all of the committee members on this work. Truly, it was a collective effort for us to go far in the work of equity and inclusion. And so to recap, here again are those 5 strands that we are addressing and each objective there. So in isolation, it may seem like one strand is working on 1 or 2 things, but in its totality, there are a number of initiatives happening related to equity and inclusion, all working together in order to make sure that District 128 is an equitable and inclusive environment for our staff and students. And like Ann and Tara said earlier, this is not new for us. District 128 has already made a commitment to equity and inclusion through its racial equity and inclusion policy. And so we wanted to highlight the alignment between each one of these objectives its strand, and our very own equity and inclusion policy and the commitments there. You will see reflected that every one of the commitments in our policy is reflected in the work that is happening here, except for two that I'll talk about momentarily. But the policy served as the foundation for the work that was to come out of this particular committee. And that could not have happened had it not been for the support and foresight of this board and this community. And so the two that are not there are commitment two, which is related to diverse staffing. But even though it's not necessarily in this particular plan, Bryant Kelly is working very tirelessly to make sure that we are looking at how we are recruiting and bringing in candidates of various diversity for our district. And the other that's not listed there is the one related to equity personnel. And that is a reflection of my position as well as the building equity coordinators. And we're using this year as a baseline to see how our work impacts teachers and students for our buildings to determine how to maximize those efforts. We thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to the implementation of this action plan as we continue to support the strategic plan for all of District 128. Thank you.
Again, if any of the board members have questions about any of the strands, each of us or Larry can take turns answering them.
I just wanted to take a moment and first of all, apologize for my late entry. But thankfully I didn't miss too much, to thank you all for the tremendous work. I know there's so much work that goes behind all this. This is sort of the tip of the iceberg of the work that's been done. So I congratulate you for that and look forward to, you know, following this path as we go, this journey as we go.
Question about the systems. You had mentioned that there were 5 or 6 objectives that were identified by the team. Can you talk a little bit about how you selected the 2 objectives that you're working on?
Yes, actually, one of Bryant and Jan were both on the systems team with me, along with teachers from both buildings. And one of the other things that were in the, I would say, top 4 was the hiring one, again, the personnel. And the other one, I'm sorry, I don't have my notes from that. Wasn't the policy one, because we already had the policy when I was thinking about. I'll have to get back to you on the detail, but once we had those systems pieces identified, it was really, what did we think had the biggest leverage across the whole plan for staff? We, especially thinking about what would touch staff and what would touch students. We felt that the idea of looking at how we're investing our money, because, you know, so many of us need the resources that we need to do the best work. And so that one, we thought that ended up being our very first priority. But our second priority was, do we focus on the hiring process, which would primarily focus on administrators, because they're the ones who typically carry out a lot of the screening of applicants and things like that. And we had already made a recommendation to invest effort as an administrative team into that work. Or would it be more beneficial to say, let's look at the student placement process, knowing that the accelerated placement law was coming forward and that we're going to have to do that work anyhow. So the committee felt very strongly that those would be our top 2, and that administrators, as part of our growth and learning, would continue to implement the changes that we needed to see in our hiring practices in terms of the monitoring, who is actually applying. Are we keeping track of how many students of color or students, male teachers applying for traditionally female roles? All of those kinds of things we had set up as targets for improvement that we are going to continue to do. We just felt that we could probably do that work under the administrative realm of improvement and focus the whole district's work on something that would be more touching more students and touching more staff.
Thank you.
I have a comment and a question. So the comment is, this is very well put together. It's a good job. I particularly liked the number 5 to sort of round it out, because when you sort of take care of the whole student, you're looking at all angles of what that student needs. So that was my personal favorite. I do have a question on the systems area, and this has been coming to my mind as we've thought through like the striving learners also. Is what can we do to have our incoming freshman class better prepared? Because you're sometimes catching students maybe at the 9th grade level that have already gotten behind, and then you're trying to play catch up with them. Is there anything that you could do with better partnership with the feeder schools so you can find these students earlier and
Well,
give them a leg up?
I think that what we're hoping for, Yesenia and some of the department leads and assistant principals are really focusing on that work this spring, because we have to have the recommendation ready. But the leadership in terms of assistant principals and principals at the middle schools that feed into us are very eager to strengthen the partnership that we have with them right now. An example, the Accelerated Placement Act requires us to use nationally normed data to make our recommendations for students. Well, we would then be meeting with the middle school to say, which data are you already doing, or what can we do to get ready for that? Is there something all of the 7th graders or 8th graders could do that we feel is really valid, that is not just for high school placement, but also would be informing them during middle school on who needs interventions? So identification of which metrics we're going to be using in the Accelerated Placement Act will be one step in that direction, and that's going to be very collaborative with our middle schools. Then we'll need to be doing the same thing. So if we have freshmen who are going to be recommended for their classes for their sophomore year, what data are we going to use during their freshman year that's going to be helpful in making placement recommendations for the following year? So it's going to help us identify the kind of measures we need to be tracking student progress. So it's not just thinking about placement. It's really, how can we know where students really know what they can know and be able to do, so that we then can match the curriculum or fill the gaps in so that they are prepared to be successful in the most rigorous classes. And so you're right, this is an opportunity for really strong partnerships with the middle school. And they also, it's so funny that you asked that, because over winter break, I was emailing with several of them, and they, both District 70 and 68 are looking at this spring doing a process of almost portrait of a graduate, or how to measure the whole child is what 73 is. And I said, we'll be at the table right there with you, because we want to know how you think you want to measure those things, because we can then dovetail off of that and make sure when we talk about how are we knowing which students have a really strong self-efficacy and strong well-being, and which ones have some areas of deficit. And so we're not waiting for them to fail 9th grade year. They're coming to us with very polished ways of us knowing what the middle school knows about their needs and about what works for them. So I actually think this is going to be a pretty important piece of work that we're taking on.
Thank you.
I have a question. So I very much appreciate the information that was outlined here for this plan. And I guess as a board member, I see the objective and the measure, but I really want to know what's next and the methods and strategies by which we get there. And so I guess my question is, when do we get to see that? I place a lot of value on the house. And I noticed when I was previewing this presentation earlier this weekend, I kept coming back to that. well, how do we increase student participation in extracurricular activities? What is kind of the middle of the sandwich, I suppose, in this process? So I would be really eager to hear those very specific plans and methods by which we hope to accomplish those objectives. And I don't know if that's within the scope of our responsibility as board members, or if that's an expectation that we would be able to set. But I mean, as a board member individually, I want to be all in on this and support, what this committee is working toward, and additionally be ready to back that up with any votes that come with that, or any funds that need to be secured to accomplish those objectives. And for me, I really would like to see those specifics of methodology when you're able to produce that for us.
What was presented tonight is the objectives, and the objectives really are the what we're going to do. What is also in our plan are the tasks, and the tasks get to the how we're going to do it. And it really outlines step by step. It is a very detailed document from A to Z, and sometimes even repeating through that alphabet again to get to those tasks. Along with that, and we whenever Dr. Herman would like, we can share that with you all. It will include our goal start and completion dates. You've seen the measures there of how we will determine how successful those objectives and tasks we were in achieving those objectives, as well as a status update as to where we are in terms of completion.
Again, I think as we're delivering the third of the 3 action plans, one of the things that we're realizing is by giving the measures, the measures, which again, accountability is one really important thing the board is responsible for. So making sure that we have identified ways that we can report to you on progress and some of the key things that the committees have been recommending. There are pages of action plans that we have not shared with you, wanting to get feedback on this first, but also realizing we need an in-between. We have this sort of 30,000 foot, here's the big ideas, we're trying to have it be so that it's more balanced and not too much work in any one of the 3 areas. But we also know in order to get the work done, we have it mapped down to tasks, and it's about a 30 or 40 page spreadsheet right now. We have those 2 things. We need a middle one. And actually, Yesenia and Larry and Aman and I were talking about that. And that's one of the hardest things to author, is that sweet spot of here's enough information where in general what's going to be happening without all of the details of things like that. But we also want to foreshadow for you any of the expenses in terms of things that are going to be coming forward that would cost money. And it will be our job between now and when we're able to get that sort of Goldilocks thing to make sure that that's very explicit to all of you. We see the need for that, not just for the board members, but for staff, for staff members who are interested in this, but who did not participate, let's say, on this. They want to know what that middle ground is. I don't want all of the details, but I want something more than what we've captured here. So we are acutely aware of the need for that as a communication tool, and we'll be working on that next. Thank you.
And if I could just jump in, I think one of the things that's going to be important, and I'm glad that the strand leaders are here to hear this, the board has to look at the expenses for the whole strategic plan before we start approving expenses for individual things. It is a big picture, and it will be difficult for us to move forward without a document or something that captures the overview of all 3 of the strategic goals and breaks down some of the expenses associated with them, because we are responsible for the district's expenses. We can't really look at one-off things without looking at it as a whole to be sure that we're making the most fiscally responsible decisions for the operation of the district, for negotiating the next teacher contract, for the strategic plan, it all has to be considered very carefully. So that might be another accompanying Goldilocks document that we might need to see before we start approving expenses.
Yeah, and you kind of said 80% of what I was gonna say, Lisa, so thank you. So as you're looking at this list also, we have to figure out how to prioritize. So obviously, tasks or expenses that support more than one objective, right? That's kind of where I would personally like to start looking at versus one-off. So maybe as you think about these documents, think about those intersections.
And I'm not sure that it's appropriate or necessary for the board to approve every expense. I mean, there'll be so many things that fall well within a department budget or district allocated expenses already. So the board isn't going to be examining every dollar. That's not our role. But I think it is helpful to just have sort of a master plan when it is time for us to approve certain expenditures, whether it's for the professional learning or hiring, additional staff, whatever it might be.
I'll just add a comment, and I know Carrie, you mentioned, is this something that, within our lane, so to speak, as a board member? And I sometimes, and I appreciate what you said, as an educator myself, I sometimes get caught in that. I really want to know, I'm really interested because, oh, by the way, at my district, I'm doing this and I'm part of that system strand and I'm getting into those weeds. And sometimes it's curiosity, how are they doing it versus how are we doing it? Sometimes it's just, that thing in the back of your head that you just want to know. But I don't think any of us are looking at trying to, nitpick those individual items. It's more out of curiosity. I think an informed board is a good thing. As long as we, don't get in your way and make sure that those things continue to move and you're not restrained in any way by what we say. The other thing that I know about this particular process is those tasks sometimes morph a little bit. You get down one path and you realize, oh, I can do this even better this way or that way. So you run the risk of getting too much detail and then it's documented and then it's, why is this different later? You need the ability to do what you need to do to get the objective completed, to get the measurements done. So I do like, Denise, your thought of having some kind of middle ground without all the minute details, but something that sort of describes what's behind these, how for these objectives instead of, now in the what of the objectives, rather than at this 30,000 foot view. But yeah, I don't know if that's.
When I was reading through it, the best way I can think of it is the objective and the measure paints the picture, but the tasks bring it to life. And I could not imagine what this is going to look like. I got the picture, but I want to see what I want to see it come to life, and not all the tasks, just something to illustrate how this kind of works.
Well,
So-
and to amplify one of Kara's points, I think it's not because we want to suggest how it comes to life or approve how it comes to life. I think there is some curiosity, especially on the part of our educators on the board, but more importantly, we want to be able to support and advocate out in the community for the work that's being done. So to the extent that we can have some of those colors filled in, it does, as Kara said, bring it to life so that we can provide that essential support as we sort of move through discussions with other community members, parents, neighbors. I had a question about professional learning, if I wasn't interrupting.
If I can just add to that.
Please.
I think this is something as a district that we're all working toward, that is going to be something we're just hopefully very proud of in the future. And very much like you just said, Lisa, this isn't about like micromanaging the minutia or the details. You are the experts, and we're so lucky to have you as those experts in implementation. I think it truly comes from being an informed board, and to be able at some point to kind of shout it from the rooftops, like, this is what we do. and we happen to do it very well, and we're proud and we want to share. Not to mention, it's completely exciting. As an educator myself, I'm nerding out a little bit about it. So, right, I want to know. But yes, it all comes from the best of places in terms of what we'd love to hear.
So my question about professional learning, I think about the teachers and everything that's on their plate. And we're moving from a voluntary learning situation to a mandatory learning situation. And I'm concerned and would like to hear your thoughts on managing that transition from voluntary to mandatory.
That was one of the questions I wanted to ask. So, thank you.
Thank you for amplifying. As a classroom teacher, I so appreciate that question too, because I at times feel overwhelmed with everything, because I want to be the absolute best teacher I can be for my students every single day. Like this morning was awesome seeing my students. So one reason that we are taking 18 months to develop the continuum is to have the time to figure out all of the logistics and to hopefully give some time to figure out how is professional learning going to work overall in our district. So I've been here since 2006. It's a lot of years. I don't want to count. And I think one of the things that I've seen change over time is the addition of PLCs and the addition of instructional coaches. And I know that change is going to continue to happen with that. So for right now, we're going to develop this curriculum, this continuum, knowing that change could potentially happen, maybe with the schedule, maybe with how instructional coaching works, maybe in some other way, and we don't know yet. So a lot of our early tasks, and the reason why we're not going to start any of the learning in that continuum for 18 months is because we have to wait and see how that could even fit in. And is it something where what is mandatory, what's voluntary? That's stuff that we have to figure out. So a lot of our early tasks, a lot of the tasks are simply figuring out where does this fit in? What does it look like? But mostly where can it fit in? Because you're right, there isn't a lot of time right now in our day. But there's so many staff members who want to learn.
Sure.
And so it's that challenge of where do we find that time? And that's been a big question too. And it's also like, ever since we became admin coordinators, I feel like we're constantly calling dibs on different institute days. Like, please, can we get a half hour? And the district's been very receptive to that and giving us time on those days. But I think,
and I know the teachers have really packed those sessions with the voluntary sessions at the institute days on equity have been standing room only. There've been teachers spilling out into the hallway, I know, for some of those sessions.
For our student panels, especially. Yeah. And I'm one of the teachers who runs our evening equity class, and we meet at night. And we currently have 23 teachers signed up for this semester.
God bless them.
And those are teachers. Yeah. That's, a Thursday evening from 6 to 8 p.m. They're taking that time to be there because this is something that's important to them. Right. So I think one of the other things we'll look at with this continuum is what are the different possibilities? What could professional learning look like? Because I think we've been operating in a pretty traditional sense of professional learning. Like we all have to be in the room together to do this. What else is out there? And I don't know what the answer is yet because we have to go see what else is out there. But I'm excited the team that we have from our strand they're so creative and so thoughtful. And some of them are full-time teachers on that strand because I teach 3 classes and I have my equity time with that. So I'm grateful to have some other educators in there who are in classes 5 periods a day and can speak to, and in different departments who can speak to like, here's what time could look like for me. And here's what the possibilities are. So, but it's definitely something that one of our first tasks is really looking at logistics and time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I hope that everybody involved in that work knows that we are very, very much paying attention to how that affects teachers. Yeah. Tara, did you have anything you wanted to add to that? Because I have a follow-up question.
That was wonderful.
Mhm.
I was just
Then-
gonna echo that the first 2, if you look at our task list that Larry had described, the first 2 tasks are to investigate logistical barriers that exist to professional learning and mindset barriers that exist to equity-related professional learning. And so we have to research and do our work there first before we can create any meaningful, long-lasting equity continuum. So I think our team is just really excited to dig in to to some of these problems that exist and try and find creative, innovative solutions.
Quick follow-up. I know that new teachers are coming out with some culturally responsive teaching and leading standards. Will the professional learning that's being developed over the next 18 months align with any of that so that our veteran teachers are sort of on the same page as the new teachers with that work?
Yeah, I don't know, Denise, if you can speak to this a little bit, but I know that there are the culturally responsive teaching and learning standards that are coming out, and there's also mandates coming out by the state as related to equity. So all of those things would be embedded within the equity continuum that we create to make sure that all staff, new staff and old staff, have access to that learning.
Right.
You said old staff, we're not gonna.
No,
we're
sorry.
not, we're not gonna.
Seasoned veteran
Veteran,
staff.
yes, yeah. Thank you.
I think the requirement that you're referring to is the standards that all of our teacher preparation programs in Illinois must include.
Yes.
So we know that students coming out of those programs have had that experience. We don't know necessarily, we don't have evidence of who's necessarily mastered that particular skill or this or that, but we do have, as part of our interview protocol, ways of trying to assess where are they. I think the equity continuum, the professional learning equity continuum will help us not just with professional learning. It will also help us with hiring and knowing where people are so that we can support any new staff who might have a strength in supporting students in maybe one subgroup, but need some more education in supporting students well in another subgroup.
Everybody has asked the questions that I want to ask, except for one. So I do have one. First, I'd like to say thank you to the teachers that are here. I appreciate both the teachers that are watching this happen, as well as the teachers that are helping this happen. So, and I'd like to thank my colleagues for the thoughtful questions that you have, because you stole everything from me. I was going to prove how smart I was asking all these great questions, but
Policies coming up. You
yeah.
have-
Oh, policies coming up. Hold on. The only question that I have is, this might be more for the board than it is for all of you, but it's relevant. And that is that in our policy 712, our equity policy, it says that the board will also be trained. And I noticed on, what was it, slide 14, that you said that all staff will have required professional development, but maybe we should say all district will have required professional development, because we are to be included in that.
We were going to send an invitation for you to actually participate during the February 20th in service that was described in terms of the microaggressions. So that would be the first opportunity for staff, or for the board to participate side by side, learning with our staff. And again, those will be throughout the day. So hopefully it will work for many of your schedules.
Good. Yeah, and it's, I just want to reinforce what Lisa's question was. Time is such a premium. And so finding the way to do that, I applaud you for being thoughtful in the process of trying to develop staff development that won't feel to the teachers like it's a waste of time. Because there's nothing more frustrating to a teacher than a loss of time. So thank you. That's it.
It's a great question, because it's important for us to understand, even if, some of us have maybe gone through some of this training. It's important for us to understand what's, learn the same things that the district staff are learning, so that we can, again, we can support, we can have the context of what's going on. So, and, we can all learn something out of this. So, yeah, make better decisions based on it. So it's great. Okay. Anything else on this? Thank you. It was
Thank you.
terrific. Okay. Now we're coming up on Don's favorite part.
No pressure. Don.
Next on the agenda is board policies. The first set, this is actually the second reading for the first set. So these are the ones that we reviewed last month and quote adopted for our first reading in December. Is there any further things, Don, that you found? Or anyone else for that?
So
matter?
real quick, the update on 5120, there was a quick update. You'll see that in red. There's just, we crossed out if any, because we do have a website. And then Dr. Herman alluded to our Institute Day in February. And policy 5120. A lot of the changes is from Faith's law. And so requirement 2 is that our staff will be trained on Faith's law. And so we'll have our school board attorneys, Himes, Petreka, and Fester will be presenting to our staff on Faith's law during that time. So that'll be one of the required times during the Institute Day. So I wanted to kind of point that out as we're updating 5120, that we are following that, and our staff will be receiving training during that Institute Day.
Okay.
Does
Great.
the policy say anything about the board having to be trained?
I don't think this one is, I gotta go back and look where
I don't think so. either.
your training is covered.
For which?
For Faith's law?
And that's one thing that, you know, IASB will need to be, you know, working on too, is the training, the requirements for the Board of Education that you all went through when you first came on as board members is changing, and then they'll help to update that so that you'll meet all the requirements too. So we'll work on that then.
Okay.
So these, again, were second reading this
Mhm.
page.
So any other updates or comments on those? Okay, we can get past those. Now, section 6 and 7, board policies. This will be for the first reading for this month, so.
And another question that came up, I think, Kara, you brought it up regarding cross-reference to 712. We did not add the cross-reference in there yet. We do have an upcoming meeting with Press Plus, which is an advancement of the press service that we use. So Carol and I talked, and so we're holding off on a couple things. We want to meet with them and see what services they provide, so that if we're doing a lot of different changes, we maybe want to talk to them on making sure that those cross references are done correctly and that they can help us with that in the future. So I know we talked about, I know going back maybe to 4120 food services, we had talked about that, and there's some other ones in these that probably our equity policy should be cross-referenced, but before we add them, we want to meet with Press Plus, go over what services they have, and let's, you know, make sure that we're not doing too much work for Carol on the back end. So I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you.
So again, another hefty one on sections 6 and 7.
Do we want, excuse me, do we want to go through these individually, or do I see Don chomping at the bit? You want to, I have a record.
So I did have the explanation in there. That first document was the explanation of each of them. If we want to go through. If there's any.
I just have a couple of questions about specific policies.
Sure.
I don't need to go through all of them.
Okay.
But I also don't have to be first. I'm willing to be.
I like it when you go first, Don.
Yeah, could you catch all?
Okay, so policy 650 school wellness.
Yep.
Isn't it interesting that we received letters about the cafeteria? 650 addresses health and wellness, and I was a little surprised. So that's just a general comment about that policy. Are we adhering to that policy based on the questions that we have received, both from the students who wrote to the board recently, as well as our own student board reps who at our last meeting mentioned something. So that really is just a question of whether or not we're following policy as opposed to a change in this particular policy. Policy 660, unless you wanted any conversation on that. No, okay. 660 curriculum content. It lists A through J, vocational education. Should we have career technical ed as part of that as opposed to vocational education? Should we? That's a semantic question more than anything else, because we do have, we have now a computer science requirement, and that's a CTE requirement. So I'm just wondering if we shouldn't have either an A through K that indicates that we're going to have some sort of career technical ed component to the
Well,
things
just
that we
for
will
the
teach.
non-educators in the room, are those two terms interchangeable? Do they mean the same thing?
That might be what I'm asking.
Right.
That's what I'm going to look up here.
I mean, this language came from press, so it might
Right.
be what press refers to, but I would say the more current
Yeah.
is career and technical education rather
Right.
than vocational education.
I think it makes
broader
more sense
term.
based on what we do. So perhaps we can look into what that is, A through J, or adding a K that says CTE.
And to your point, I think it's broader term as well. So it includes.
So I wonder if
In
in
my
your
mind.
meeting with Press Plus, you could ask, and maybe they just haven't considered updating that terminology to be broader and more in line with what districts are calling that type of coursework.
Yeah, I'm looking in their current.
I mean, it could also be the state that is
Yeah.
not having it
Sure.
updated quickly enough because the state still uses F foreign language when the more accepted term is world language.
Right.
But that is still how the state refers to it.
So do you have any thoughts about, I mean, yes, we want to be in line with press, but these are our policies.
Right.
And if
Right.
I'm not comfortable sticking
Mm-hmm.
with foreign languages when we know it's world languages.
Right. Yep.
And we have every right to do that.
Mhm.
We adopt a policy. I think maybe those things again are sort of a press plus kind of question as to how deep do we get into these very specific terms in so many policies and maintaining those and
Right, I mean, I don't want to get too
Yeah.
into the weeds, but at the same time, this reflects our,
this is our policy.
this is
This what we
our
believe.
policy. This is our district philosophy, and this is what we are using to guide our work. And as a board, we do have the discretion to say, that's not the term we use
Right.
in this district.
I agree.
I'd be okay changing those.
We can definitely look more into the vocational ed versus CTE in terms of if there are any distinctions between ISBE, but then we can also, once we have that answer, do the search all and replace.
Sure, thank you.
Okay, and then also in 660, item 9 says in all schools, health education must be stressed, including. And then it lists A through E. I have new contacts, so I'm having a hard time. This one's close and this one's far, and it's really messing with my head, so please forgive any delays. So I looked through this and I don't see that we are requiring any sort of age appropriate comprehensive sex education in our health education. Now, I assume that we are teaching sex education in our health education. And so I thought I'd do some poking around and see if I could find something.
I had a feeling you'd say that.
And did you know that Jasmine Lafita last year wrote an article in Drops of Ink regarding sex education in our schools and how woefully short of the market is in terms of what should be and what is taught? And I would ask us to start considering what we think is appropriate. Further, Ed Red sent out a notice just a few days ago saying that there is the potential of all districts mandatorily adopting, where in the past it has been something that you can adopt or So when I looked and saw that we actually didn't have a policy that states that we will teach sex ed, I was kind of surprised by that. So I would challenge this board and our administrators to start considering whether or not we would put into our policy that this is something that we will teach in this district because it reflects the values of our community. Our community does want our kids to know about their own health. And I think that that should be reflected in our policy. Anyway, the Drops of Ink article is a good read. So go back and find it. It was March 30th of 2021. And kudos to her. But I'd be interested to hear what either my other board members or the administrators here think.
Are
Well,
you, oh,
Go ahead, go
are
ahead.
you looking for policy that's just more specific?
Yeah.
Outlining curriculum?
Yeah, saying an age-appropriate sexual health curriculum. Because right now, if you search our website for mentions of sex, there are 37 references to sexual assault or sex crime. And there are no mentions for sexual health, which I think is problematic. We're willing to study what's wrong, but not what's right.
Well, and I'm curious if curricularly that is happening and maybe it's just not reflected in policy.
Right.
Yeah, to the extent that, maybe this article reflects how well or how not well we're accomplishing that. But to your point, I agree with your point that it should be, if we're doing that, it should be in policy. That's part of our role as a board. I wonder though, because of the how quickly that the EdRed thing, the bill will come up. If we would wind up just turning right around and changing the language anyway.
That's a good
So I
point.
wonder if we let that play through these next, I don't know how long that's going to be before that's resolved. But to let that work its way through and then have the language in here reflected that actually reflects the requirement, the assumed requirement that we will have. And the exceptions to the rule and all those other things that will come along with that.
You make a really good point there, because this is, if that law goes through, its implementation date is fall of next year, or fall of this
Yes.
year rather.
Mhm.
So.
Yeah, it's a
yes,
really quick
maybe we
turnaround.
should just hold off on it until the state makes a decision.
Well, I think we can start on our end investigating. I know from speaking with the physical welfare department supervisors, now department chairs. They do feel that we have a fairly comprehensive sexual education, but I think they also are hearing from students that for some students, it's the first semester of freshman year.
Right.
And
It's a timing
it's
issue.
it's a timing issue and almost like a readiness issue. Some of the things that they are maybe experiencing or challenged with are not happening until upperclassmen. And
Right.
so I think some of the students have talked about almost like a health A and a health B and, maybe integrating it more or something like that, because your needs for understanding your body change as you go from being a freshman to a senior.
Right.
So.
Anything else on that one? No. Any other ones, Don?
No, my last one's just a general question, but it doesn't need to be answered here. So I'll send it to Denise sometime.
Okay. Anyone else have comments on any of these? Okay, again, this is first reading. These will show up on the board meeting this month, and then we'll have another opportunity in February to discuss these at this committee meeting in February, and then vote on them at the board meeting in February. So
Can I just ask a quick question? When I was reviewing policy earlier, I noted that most of our items that we were looking at had all been revised and adopted last year in 2022. Can someone remind me? I was under the impression that we cycle policy for review every 2 years, but am I mistaken?
So press, if Public Act is updated.
Got
They go through and they, update their policies right away. They also do like a 5-year review of, more language, or changes in, as you know, educators like to use, initials and different, shortcuts. So sometimes those change in 5 years. And so they'll make those changes. I would say that in the last 3 years, there have been more changes due to more laws being passed, more public acts. And so, as you can see, I mean, this was a lot just from the recent public act. So there are some that it seems like we are updating almost every cycle.
Because
So-
we did do this section
Right,
last year. You
right.
are not imagining
Honestly, I
it.
thought I was like having a really bad case of deja
No,
vu this
no.
weekend, but, okay, so it essentially every time press updates, we're gonna receive an update on policy to review.
Correct.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. Anything, for example, if you look at 6:50, the public act was renumbered, so you have to change the policy because it references that public act and the number on that public act changed. So, so sometimes it's not really a substance change in the policy. It's just they recognize that something changed in the law or in the school code, and they have to make those minor adjustments.
I did have one other thing about 660. I'm sorry. Just the general itemization of what we do. It says in all schools. So several of those say in all schools, conservation of natural resources. In all schools, United States history must be taught. In all schools, courses concerning US history or a combination, and so on. When we say that, does it imply all students will be exposed to, or does it simply state we will offer this regardless of whether or not a student gains this instruction?
Do you want to start? I'll go ahead and start. In general, I think that some of the language here is more about what we're required to offer. Some of the more specific ones on graduation requirements, I think
Right.
are the ones that we have to show competency before students can exit. So I think that's sometimes how I distinguish between the two. You need to offer these learning experiences, let's say about Japanese American history.
Right.
So that one, we have to show that we spent classroom time instructing students on that history. We don't have to show that they've all mastered that history, but a different one, like you referred to the computer science, where are we showing that does require not just teaching, but that we have evidence that students have mastered that. So where are we gathering evidence that students have gained those specific knowledge and skills? And it doesn't have to be a separate course, but we do have to have ways of saying they gained these 2 skills in this class, and here's where we're gathering that information. I also think that this particular policy 6.60 is one that we're going to be coming back to a few times over the next few years, because we do have the changing state graduation guidelines, and those will be for the class of 2026-7. So to be
we're-
ready for them, we have to grandfather those in. So we're going to be working on updating graduation requirements. So this policy will become pretty familiar to all of you, I think, in the next year or two.
Yeah, and I was looking for, this summer, there was a lot of talk about the national sex ed standards that Illinois adopted. And so we did have our PE department chairs engage in analysis of what parts of those standards we teach and we do not teach. And there are a number of areas that we don't cover in our curriculum at the moment. So we are aware what those areas are and the adjustments that we need to make so that we do have a more comprehensive sex ed curriculum.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I had a question on policy 6340, the student testing.
Okay, so before you go there, I just wanted one more comment
Yeah.
on this, then, if you don't mind. I agree with your concern here, because it's confusing. There's a lot of, in all schools and all grades, and grades 9 through 12, but it doesn't say all students.
Right.
Or all history students, or all whatever. So I think that's
some unifying language, I think would really make
Tighten it up.
the policy.
Or more
Much
specific language
clearer.
anyway, because some of these are likely like the cyber, what was, I'm trying to find the item. I know there's a requirement now that all students have some cybersecurity, cyber awareness, whatever.
Right.
That all students have to have that available to them. And in other cases, you just have to have a course or a particular item available, but not necessarily all students take it. So I think
Maybe we could separate it, like these are the things that all students do. These are the things that we are required to offer, and students may engage in the.
yeah, required to offer versus required to take, it's kind of thing. So I agree. I think it's a little confusing at times. So.
Well, you also though have the graduation requirements that are included, in which policy, so then if you go to, graduation requirements in 6-300, so then you have so then you have some, I guess, requirements that are listed in there, whereas maybe these are more the courses that are being offered.
And I think the state, as they're adding additional mandates, it's sort of blurring the edges. I think
Yeah.
in a way, they're trying to give districts flexibility to implement it by not having to offer a new course.
Sure.
But I think it is clouding the people's understanding a little bit of, okay, so if this is all students must gain this experience, where in your existing courses are you going to make sure that happens? And if you're not going to add a new course. And so I think us getting more clear on some of those languages, where we say, here's our graduation requirements and here's additional state requirements that are also embedded in these other courses.
I think it's probably also helpful to designate where a student or a family might opt out of certain things. I think there are a few political landmines in all of these mandates. And for some of them, it will be a graduation requirement that can't be opted out of, but some might include a provision from the state that a family can opt their student out of certain things. And I think having a policy will make it much clearer, and where it might get cloudy with, a political hot potato, having a strong policy that outlines what's optional and what's not, I think will make it much easier for administrators.
Yes, and I think one other thing that we'll be doing this year is there's the Illinois mandated units of study document that we should be completing every year. And so Ray, Joe and I have developed a schedule. We want to have it done by May, and that because it also requires that we provide professional development and training to teachers on any new things that may be coming up when the new school year starts. So that is something that we will begin to do this year. And I think that will help with some of these questions.
Cara, sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, that's okay. I'm sorry. It's more of a question that I have for policy 6340 on student testing. When we were discussing finals before the end of vacation, I had Don in my ear and I go, where's our policy? And there is no policy on finals. So I guess my question is, do we need a policy? I read 6340 more is about state standardized testing and what our requirements are for standardized testing. There really is no testing policy in our policies I couldn't find anything.
Right. Well, I think that is something that the board identified last year as a need, but we did not feel with all the other strategic planning work that we could complete that work last year. So that carried over, and actually that is a committee that Yesenia is chairing that is looking at grading assessment to look at what are the consistent practices we want across the district, not identical, but what are the things that no matter which teacher you have, your work is going to be scored in a similar way. Because we don't have those things identified either. So we do have a committee of teachers who is working right now to help create some of that language. And I think that would be a good place for, what do we think cumulative assessment should look like? There's not a one size fit all, but how can we put some clear parameters so kids and parents and teachers all know the boundaries of what's expected?
Okay. You get back to my screen here. Any other comments, questions on the board policies? Don't worry, we will see them again. Okay. Next on the agenda, I can pull it up here, is employment of employees. Anything to highlight here, Brian?
Any questions on?
No.
I
Okay.
had a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Anybody else want to start? I noticed Mary Sass resigned. Is that going to make your work in transitioning some of the classes, the most popular classes to our community partners more difficult?
No, so Mary was one of our evening community ed clerks. And that when people came to attend classes, she would check them in or get them to the right classroom.
I see.
So she was just working 10 hours a week or so,
I
something
see.
like that. So we're filling in with other people in the meantime. Mark that worked up here and some other people.
Okay, got it.
Any other questions or comments? Personnel report? Okay, moving on, Director of College and Career Readiness.
Before I go to that one, we did have I'm told it's called a walk-on item.
Okay.
And so I left a packet at each of your spots there. We received an ed tour request this morning, and Michelle worked closely with Mr. McDonald over at Vernon Hills High School to get everything we needed to make sure that it was on the docket for this evening. It was if it wouldn't have made it to the docket today, the team wouldn't be going to their spring trip for baseball. Mr. McDonald sends his apologies. There was a new coach hired who is not a district or teacher staff. So it just made the timeline a little bit longer in terms of like getting everything all squared away. The good news is that they have a significant amount of money in their activity fund because they haven't been on a trip in a while. So the majority of these costs are going to be covered. And the approximate parent and student contribution is about $214 per student and family, which is not significant for like the one they're taking. So if anybody has any questions, I do apologize for the tardiness and just leaving it on your table there.
Anyone with questions?
And again, this will be for a vote in 2 weeks.
Correct.
End of the month, yeah.
If you should have any follow-up questions, I'm sure Yesenia can answer.
Yeah, I will make sure to send you the itinerary and all that electronically.
Okay.
If
This
it
looks
needs to be
similar to-
discussed, it could be removed from the consent agenda.
Say that again?
If it needs to be discussed, it could be removed from the consent agenda.
Right.
And I will remember to ask before we.
I was helping you out there.
Thank you. Since you'll be sitting to my left, you can remind me again in 3 weeks.
Okay.
Thanks. And the next one, the Director of College and Career Readiness, we kind of foreshadowed this at our presentation in December. This is the first task of our Explore Multiple Paths action plan. The first task was to develop this job description, and hopefully we can get someone great and who's excited about helping us forge this work forward. So we did look at several job descriptions, and there was also one that had already been started in the district. So you have the attached draft of that job description. If we have your support this evening, Brian and Dan will commence their financial analysis to determine a nice competitive salary.
So this is a net new position. Correct?
Yes.
And it's not subsidized by grants.
No.
And what's the ballpark annual salary?
We looked at a few, and it was between 130 and 150. So they'd have to do a little bit of a deeper analysis into what we pay current directors and what other districts are paying.
And how many direct reports will this director have? Are there like 5 people, 6 people that?
So
Full report.
in our Explore Multiple Paths action plan, they requested that, we have this one position that kind of oversees the entire work, and that each of the schools would have someone who is directly responsible for the work at the schools. However, we feel that there could be an analysis, there should be an analysis of the people that are currently doing some of those things at the schools, so that we can better determine like the responsibilities and what pieces can stay within like the college and career center. I forget the name of it.
We have 2 people working in each of our college career centers.
Yes. Mhm,
And so
as
now those 2 people, who did they report to prior to this?
the principals.
Okay, and so now that the principal we've taken out of that mix and they will report to,
So that's
No, they're
something,
gonna report to Yesenia. Oh, you're talking about the College Career Center?
yeah, we're hiring a new person.
They're
who's
gonna
going
report to this person and this person reports to Yesenia.
Right.
Yeah. So the way that this is worded for the qualifications, I'm concerned that at that salary level, that somebody without administrative experience or career and technical education certification could potentially be a fit for that role.
yeah, so we put the CTE endorsement as preferred, just I think in part of our work with some of the people that have been very passionate about this. Perhaps a counselor who doesn't have that CTE endorsement technically, but understands the work very closely because they've been doing maybe some internship, you're helping kids find internships or apprenticeships. They have that lens. And so I think we would be, I think there are certain parameters that we want, right? And so we want someone who has a really deep understanding of the work, especially as it aligns to the ISB requirements. And so we felt like perhaps that would have been a barrier. Because I think we have some great people in the district who don't have that CT endorsement who would be a great fit.
we couldn't expect them to gain that within the role that they're fulfilling. Like over a period of time, we would expect them to have.
Is that something that you would set up as an expectation for this role?
I think we could. It's not a very long, like a endorsement to obtain.
Well, I guess it's up to you whether or not that's necessary. I wouldn't feel comfortable, personally imposing that in order to approve this, but I guess I am wondering where this fits in with all of the other elements for the strategic plan. It's a big ask, I think, to approve this role, not knowing what other roles we're going to be asked to approve to support the strategic plan. And that's my concern. I don't have an objection to the role philosophically, but it makes me very nervous adding another person to admin before we've taken a look at the strategic plan and how many other roles we might be asked to add. We have to be very thoughtful about adding net new administrators.
One of the challenges that we face when we do the presentation and we have the positive energy around the CCRI information last time. And we were able to really focus in on all the good things that would be happening for our students, because we do have 2 CTE coordinators right now, and they are working very hard. But it's very difficult for 2 people with other responsibilities to be reaching out to our businesses and to be doing all of those things that we would be using district dollars more efficiently if one person was doing that on behalf of both campuses. So we really look at this position as cost savings. We are going to be required to do the CCRI work. That's an expectation for the state of Illinois. We're trying to make sure that we get on the ground level to get the most qualified people to help us meet that expectation. In terms of other, and the other thing about this particular position, we did foreshadow this last spring when we were talking about what we saw as missing positions based on what we knew the needs of the district were in the next 5 years. But we said we wanted to wait until the teacher committee had an opportunity to weigh in on what that position would look like. And because their recommendation was very clear, they thought it should be one district person. We feel we'll get the highest qualified person by it being administrators, so they had classroom experience. Some districts have it be an ESP position and it's someone from the workplace, actually. So it's more from the internship part. So I think we do have some flexibility with this in terms of, that's why we tried to write the job description in a flexible way, because there could be some very strong candidates who might not have been a CTE teacher previously, but they may have been. So we wanted to make sure that as we posted the position, we were casting a fairly broad net, because we already have some really talented people who know a lot about CTE. Not that we wouldn't want more people, but we have some very strong people in our current CTE chairs, and we're hiring another person for the retiring chair here at Libertyville. So I think we were trying to make sure any new hire was complementing our existing staff. And the parts that we're missing are that community outreach, the internships, the state requirements, all of those things. And that can be difficult to manage at the site level.
I might add, my understanding of the whole CCRI, the career pathways, all these new things that we will now be required to do by the state and by ISB. Those kinds of programs aren't necessarily just CTE programs.
Correct.
So career pathways can be a lot of different things,
Yes.
not just
Academics.
not just the CTE program. So my feeling on that is it'd be nice to have somebody with that background, but I wouldn't think that that's a deal breaker at all. In fact, the farther we get with this and the more we get into various career pathways in the future, that'll become less and less relevant. So just my 2 cents.
Can I just add a thought in terms of the funding? So there is not a funding source that exists that would pay for something like this. However, remember, like, we were looking at district-wide at things that align or didn't align. And the board made a decision to discontinue our community education program as it's currently manifested. And so part of that idea was you can redirect that towards something towards our strategic plan. This is an example of a way that you can do that. Now, for sure, it's legit to say, how can I look at this without seeing the whole picture? I think that's legitimate. But I just wanted to just remind you that, the board has looked at ways to offset some of the anticipated increased costs associated with the strategic plan. So you can't count everything against it, right? Because you're going to run out. But there's things that you've already considered that would help offset some of the things, so that it's not necessarily, not everything we're talking about is just a net add cost to the district. Because we intentionally looked at a different program to discontinue, to redirect towards these efforts.
Thank you.
We also included potential hiring in our budget. Is that correct? Didn't we put a line item for strategic plan into our current budget?
We did put $100,000 contingency in this year's budget for strategic planning. Reminder, it was a deficit budget, but we put that in. We've already eaten at least half of that already because of the MTSS program, that we're looking at. But yeah, we did put some of that in. Now, I think this position is more next year.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Just going to ask that
Right.
question. This is a July 1.
Right.
Hire.
MTSS, just for anybody who's listening, is the additional Power School software that we approved at the December board meeting. Sorry, Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, so in order to answer those questions and have everyone feel as comfortable as we can and still meet a logical deadline to approve this position and hire this position so that we don't miss out on those candidates, what's our next step that we could take if we're, are we comfortable with trying to get some of those questions answered fairly quickly, or with the information that Dan has just provided, or do we need to pull this off the agenda for this month? I guess I'm just asking collectively how
We could
comfortable.
poll our members now to get an idea of what they think. And then we'd have a good idea going into the next meeting. I, for one, support the idea philosophically and practically. So I'm always a little concerned about hiring another administrator when we could hire teachers to take some of the load off. But in this particular case, it was part of the strategic plan. So I support it.
Anyone else have some thoughts?
I certainly agree with Don that I support this, both strategically and in process. I'm not necessarily comfortable approving it without knowing what else might be a part of the bigger picture in terms of needs. This would be a significant amount of money, and it would be adding another administrative position. So I'm not asking for dollar amounts, to the T, but just a little more comfort with what does the big picture look like? Like what other staffing requirements are you thinking are coming down through this process? And I'd be a little more comfortable knowing that before I was willing to vote on this. Okay.
I agree. I know this is something that we were all excited for. I'm not sure I envisioned it as an admin position when we talked about it. I saw it more as a practical internship, community liaison, more of on the business side. I am very sensitive to, we have already added, I mean, I know it's only a net 0.3, but we have already added many administrators at the district level, administrators at the district level. So I guess I would want to see, one, the whole picture, what we're looking at as far as the whole plan. Two, what are some of the redundancies that this position is going to take over from each building? And is that what the building wants? I guess that, sometimes I think we take things away from each building and they want to have their own identity in that building. Is that it? So I'm assuming in your committee, you've said that the teachers have said they want to have this district.
Yesenia has definitely echoed that. Maybe you can comment on it.
Yeah, so when we started our work, we divided up into 3 subgroups, and this was the one recommendation that came from each of the subgroups. So it is something that came from the committee there was plenty of teacher representation on it. I think that they feel that this is really important work, and they want to be able to give the time and dedication to it that it needs to be successful.
So I guess I'm looking for how it affects what's currently happening in each building, how this position is either going to alleviate or add to that, what's already happening in the buildings. And then also more of a larger picture of what we're looking at coming in for all 3 prongs of our strategic plan. As far as expenditures, like where does this fit?
Okay, so we can get back to you. I think in terms of like what's happening at the buildings, we don't have a way for students to be to have exposure to internships or apprenticeship. That's not something that is currently happening. We don't have strong relationships, and we're currently working on one relationship with BCU, and that's through at Burton Hills High School. But outside of that, we don't have those opportunities established right now.
But you would appreciate having something that more clearly delineated some of those things that without this position, these would continue to be voids in our student experience. And we know that our students need these, and to very clearly articulate that, because we assume some of these things are already happening. Right. And so I think making more clear what would be new work that this person would be doing, what would be work that would be coordinating the work of existing people. We could definitely refine or put a memo together that clarifies that in the job description.
Indeed, I'm always excited about this because I think this has been a missing piece in our students' journeys. But we have to look at the cost of it. I think it would be, as we kind of look at the next steps, it would be good. Dan pointed out and reminded us about, we've done one sort of offsetting, if you will. So with the community education program, so maybe factor that in. And also would be helpful to see what other schools, how do they how have they established these programs? Like we have a few in just our neighborhood that have strong programs.
Yeah, both Grays Lake and Lake Zurich have very strong programs that have been recognized across the state. And those are two of the job descriptions that we did use. So it's this structure for a high school district is very common. It's not something that we're going out on a limb to particularly make up ourselves, but we can definitely reference that for you.
I see this as a long-term investment. That's why I want to be very careful about it, right? The worst thing we can do is not have the money for programs that were, and we said that
Yes.
was going to be a non-starter,
Mhm.
right? So I see this as a long-term commitment. I want to make sure that we do it right the first time. And I'm sure we all do, not just me, but I want to,
We can make all of those things much more clear, and those are things that I think when you're bringing a new proposal, you're not quite sure all of the things the board might need to know. So you helping us get more clear on, no, this is what I need to feel confident moving forward with this particular position. We really appreciate that.
We have a lot of exciting things going on with the strategic plan. I think we're just thinking there's going to be other things. So I want to see more of the big picture in terms of what other staffing requirements we might need to, because I don't want us to get into a position where we are overcommitted. As Kara said, that is something we said from the beginning that we weren't going to do.
Yeah, and something to be certain though is the strategic plan, just because we're taking on some path of, some tasks, some whatever, doesn't always mean we got to add more people.
Right.
It could be, the strategic plan just is the direction that the existing staff or the existing program goes. So I guess I'm less concerned that where's the next shoe to drop in terms of staffing, but I understand the concern that, without us knowing what could be possible, although, again, we have the ability to, we'll vote on those. If there's another one that comes down the pipeline, we'll be voting on that as well. But to Kara's point, you want to do it right the first time. So we don't want to get ourselves into a situation where, darn, I wish we would have thought about this before we approve this. What I will tell you is like Denise has said, it with schools around here, schools around where I am. The district I work for is a third the size of our district. We have an administrator like this, a position like this. So it's something that's both important for our students, but also important to keep up with the requirements of the state. So.
All very helpful information. So it sounds like with the additional information that we discussed, we still might be in a position to make this decision at the board meeting at the end of the month.
Some further discussion.
Can somebody speak to the 3 grants that are listed? What are those grants and what will they do for us?
So those are current grants that the CTE department chairs co-write, and then I help manage, but those are the grants that are used to fund like the supplies and instructional materials for the CTE departments, as well as some professional development.
And will this person be responsible for coordinating we talked about some dual credit pathways
Yes,
programs this person would be,
yeah, developing the ISB career pathways.
and that is in the job responsibilities.
Yes.
Thank you.
Who, just out of curiosity, when Don asked that question, who manages the grants now?
The 2 department chairs and myself.
Okay, so collectively you get together. So this would centralize those in one spot to be able to manage that.
And it'll free those people up from having to do that task so that they can do their jobs.
At the school level, right?
Do you anticipate any internal candidates?
I think we have some folks here who would be really great at it. I don't know if we'll be able to convince them, but I do think that we have some really great folks here.
Okay. Anything else on that topic?
It's a good discussion.
Yeah, no, it's a very good discussion. Thank you. EL program.
Dan has my presentation and he's going to be my clicker.
Yeah. We were talking so long, the projector turned itself off.
Well, that's going. I kind of just created a historical, just the past 5 years, looking at enrollment numbers. And then there's some definition of terms because there's a lot of very EL specific jargon that is used in the EL world. And so you're not going to be introduced to all of them tonight, but just some very important ones. And then identifying some of the needs that we've seen this year, specifically with increase in enrollment that we hadn't seen an increase like this in the 5 years that I looked.
Hold, please.
Holding.
Hold, please.
Thank you, Dan. So if you could go to the first one, please. So here you see our enrollment, and we have it broken down as a whole district and then by school. And I included our outplaced English learners on here because even though they may not be in our schools, we are still responsible to make sure that they get the appropriate services. So as you can see, in 2018-19, we had a total of 73 students in the district. And right now, the 2022-2023 numbers I pulled the last week because I wanted to have the most up-to-date numbers in case that we had any new students enroll before we went home for break. And so we're at 120 as of last week. And there are 25 students who have identified on their registration that they are first year in the district this year. So we've received 25 new students and whose time this year is their first time in a U.S. school, which is some of the things that have come up at the schools in terms of programming and servicing. So as you can see, we've grown a little bit faster than I think the district had anticipated or that the district was used to. If you want to go to the next one, Dan, here you have that breakdown by grade level.
The 50% increase over last year. I'm just noticing that it's a 50% increase over last year. It's only affecting our total enrollment by 1.1%, but in terms of just straight English learners, it's an increase from last year. In 1 year, we've had a 50% increase.
Yes, and I think that's part of what the anxiousness that we're feeling in our schools, or like, you know, our student, even our student board members have brought it up in their student board reports, right? I think there's just a lot of differentiation and needs that come with ELs that I don't think our system was ready for. And so we are definitely feeling some of that. The next slide, Dan. And so this was something that was really interesting to me. We have a total of 23 languages represented in our English learners in the district. About 50% of those are Spanish speakers, 13% speak Russian, 8% Ukrainian, and then 29% the other languages. But when I was looking at this data 5 years ago in 2018-19, the order was different. It was Spanish, Russian, Chinese, and Korean. And so it was really interesting to see how that started to change in the past 3 years. And so we're going to get to our definitions here. And so an English learner is identified as any student who identifies their native language as a language other than English in the home language survey that is completed at registration time. And so they are considered an English learner until they are able to meet the state's proficiency level on the state assessments and are able to fully integrate into the mainstream classrooms. And so we're actually, our state mandated testing or assessment for English learners is starting this month. And so our schools are preparing to do that, our annual access assessment. And so students have to meet the language proficiency guidelines set by the state in order to exit or no longer be identified as an EL. And this is also a newer term if you've been around education, we used to call them ELLs. And about 7 years ago, the federal government dropped one of the L's. So ISB did that too. One of the other changes that ISB did about 2.5 years ago is that they are no longer the Division of English Learners, but they're the multilingual departments. And so districts across the state have started to change from EL departments or whatever it is that they were called to multilingual departments, just because they feel that it's not just that their students are learning English, but they're just becoming multilingual. It was more of a shift to an asset-based language. And the next term we have is English as a second language. And so this is the content area that in which they receive very explicit instruction on how to manage those 4 domains of language. And so a lot of people who sometimes use this interchangeably. And so I like to tell people EL is when we're talking about the student, and ESL is when we're talking about what they're learning. Sometimes you'll hear people describe students as ESL students. But,
Not to put too fine a point on it, but we have students that are learning English as their 3rd or 4th or 5th language. So I'm not crazy about English as a second language, assuming that they don't speak other languages, because in many parts of the world, it's common to speak 2 or 3 languages.
yes, and we have some students like that here. I actually met a family who was during one of the open houses who they were Chinese descent, but they had somehow their parents had been transferred to Chile or Peru when they were little. And so they spoke fluent Spanish, and their kids spoke fluent Spanish as well as English, and they were, speaking Mandarin too. So we do have those situations.
Yeah, I just was speaking with someone in the district who was born in Vietnam, but went to school in Russia, speaks fluent Russian and some Ukrainian, in addition to the Viet language that they grew up with. So when they learned English, it wasn't their second language, it was their 4th.
Wouldn't we all like to know 4 languages?
Yes, wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah. And so
There's an
the
app called Duolingo.
Sorry.
The next term is something that we're going to be learning a lot because we've met the requirements to have to offer a TBE program. So transitional bilingual education is the term that the state and the federal government uses to identify the program that students who need to receive instruction in their native language in the core content areas is called. It's called TBE. I personally am not a big fan of it, but kind of what we have to call it, right? And so for the purposes of this evening, you'll see students identified as TBE part-time and TBE full-time. And so that is just identifies like where they are on the spectrum of demonstrating proficiency in English. And so the next one is the transitional program of instruction. And so this is traditionally, this is the program the district has offered because we've never had 20 students at one building who have identified the same language as their home language. So this is a program that is used when you're teaching in a district that has many languages representative. And so the approach is more of they receive more of an ESL only type instruction where they don't have to receive content in their native language. They can receive support, but it's not required that they have like a math class in Ukrainian, just that we support them. Next one, Dan. And so here are the components of a TBE program. We have to offer the core content areas in their native language. So that would be math, science, social studies. And we also have to offer language arts in their native language. They also have to receive a period of ESL where they are learning to dominate the language, or English is the target language. And they have to receive instruction in the history and culture of the area that their family comes from and the United States. If the native language that identified is Spanish, then that Spanish language arts instruction has to be aligned to the Illinois State Board of Education Spanish Language Arts standards that were developed and published this year. So this is the first year that school districts will have to align to the SLA standards. Along with a TBE program comes something that is called the Bilingual Parent Advisory Council. So this is a requirement that asks that districts create a parent advisory committee that consists of parents or legal guardians of our TBE teachers, of our counselors, or just folks that are working with those populations and some folks from the community to participate in the planning, operation, and evaluation of our TBE program. They ask that the majority of the committee be representatives of parents or legal guardians of the students enrolled in the program. Membership in the committee is a representation of all the languages served in the program to the extent possible. They have to meet 4 times a year. We have to keep, of course, agenda sign-in sheets for all of these meetings. They have to review the district's annual program application to the Illinois State Board of Education for EL programming, as well as approve any of the, if we were to start receiving Title III funds, they would have to approve the plan to spend those funds. And then they
The
also
Parent
have,
Advisory Council would have to approve it?
yes. And that was something that was added a handful of years ago. ISB was finding that districts were receiving Title III funds and not using it for EL programming. And so we do have a BPAC now at Vernon Hills. That was something that was established this fall, and they've had their first meeting. So that is exciting. Next one there is the licensure requirements. So for all of our teachers teaching in our TBE program, it's required that they have a content area endorsement as well as a bilingual endorsement in the target language. So we would need Spanish-speaking math teacher, Spanish-speaking science teacher, Spanish-speaking history teacher, as well as a teacher who could teach Spanish language arts. And then for all of our TPI program, which is what, yes.
Stop you there. Does that identify a need for us to hire additional staff? Or do we have staff that can fill that need?
No, we don't. So this is something that we'll have to look at staffing. I'm not familiar with how many people are retiring, what are the areas that people are retiring in. That's something that I'm hoping to learn about this in this staffing plan that's or time that's coming up. I think we start in February, March.
That definitely has been something that as we've been hiring administrators and teachers, we've been looking for bilingual candidates. It's just something that we know they bring to the classroom experience, if nothing else. But it can be difficult to find people who have a math degree and are fluent in Spanish. But that's what some of the districts surrounding us have been facing, that challenge. Because it is something that we are obligated to try and do our recruiting to meet that need.
So I'm curious, do you have any sense of if, say, for example, we identify a need for a bilingual English and Spanish speaking math teacher at Vernon Hills High School, but we're unable to find one. Are we in any way penalized for if we can show evidence of trying to hire one?
We wouldn't be penalized because we don't have enough students to receive funding for EL programming.
I see.
If we were audited, if our district was selected to be audited for EL programming, we would have to then come up with a plan and a timeline on how we were going to fulfill and meet that need.
Thank you.
So and this is just I apologize if this has sort of been answered or implied. You were saying 20 students in a school in a particular language kicks in certain requirements.
Correct.
Do we have that at Vernon Hills at this point in time? We have 20 EL students.
Yes.
Spanish speaking EL students
Yeah, we reached that threshold last year.
because of the increase in okay. So now all this stuff has to kick in. Yeah.
Yes.
So it kicks in, but no funding is kicked in.
So we have to have, once, we have to receive a minimum of $10,000 in Title III funds. But we're not there yet in terms of per pupil allocation.
Okay, so just to be clear, we have to fulfill the state requirements, but there is no state funding provided at the threshold that we currently are at.
Right, so ISB will say that there are Title III funds that typically it's not a lot, it's supplemental, right?
Okay.
You're required to provide a teacher for your EL students.
Sure, I mean, and that makes sense. You're meeting the need of a student. I don't object to that. I'm just making sure I'm crystal clear on where the funding for the mandate is coming from, and that's coming from the district.
Mhm.
Got it.
TPI is the program that we have been delivering, and that's when we have, many languages spoken, and so teachers just need to have an ESL endorsement. And so we do have teachers who have ESL endorsements at both schools. And they're working very hard. We have an overload happening over at Vernon Hills with science. And there's still more support needed. The next one is the licensure requirements for administrators. So once you hit a population of 200 students, it requires that you designate an administrator to oversee the program. There is a lot of compliance pieces that come with EL programming in terms of entry testing. There's annual letters that have to be mailed out at the beginning of every year to tell and inform families what type of program they are being enrolled in, what are the components of each of those programs. There's the annual federally mandated assessment, and then there are end of the school year letters that need to be sent out in terms of communicating the scores that were attained on the access and then the programming for next year. And so there's a lot of compliance pieces, and these are things that happen annually. I like to tell people that think of a special ed child and you have a lot of paperwork that needs to be done every time you get an IEP. With an EL, that paperwork has to be done every year. And so there's a lot of maintenance in terms of files and making sure that we've dotted our T's and crossed our I's for all of the compliance pieces. And so the state also requires of the administrator that is assigned to oversee the program to have, if it is a TBE program, to have a bilingual endorsement. And if they don't, we need to have a professional development plan. They have to receive a certain number of hours annually. I think it's about 18. If it's not a TBE program, then it can be someone who has an admin license and an ESL endorsement. So like you said, we have seen a significant increase in enrollment from last year to this year. And Vernon Hills did meet the threshold for a TBE program last year. Currently, as the program is structured, it does not meet compliance as set forth in the Illinois School Code. Again, you could go to the next one. So here we have the students in terms of TBE full-time and part-time, and you'll see that we went from having 25 students designated as TBE last year and 0 as TBE full-time to 17 as TBE full-time. And so the majority of your newcomers are going to be full-time students. So they have to, not only do we have to teach them how to navigate an American school, but you have to teach them the basics of the language, just so they can communicate socially. But also then we have to make sure that they're getting the appropriate access to grade level content and curriculum in their native language. And so it's tricky. We don't have a large number of parent refusals, which is great. And then we have a handful of years ago, we had a couple of students on a 22827 plan. That's not very common. So I was actually really surprised to see that we had that a couple of years ago here. We don't have any now. And then we do have 2 students whose status was missing.
Yesenia, what is that? 22827 plan, just.
So
clarify.
a handful of years ago, like if you had very severe special ed needs and you were an EL, there was like it's really hard to meet the needs of both of those. because there's not a lot of people who can do that. And so there was a special plan that kind of allowed the students to not have as, their EL program was not as prioritized as their special ed needs.
Okay.
And I'm sorry for my ignorance, but parents refuse. What does that look like? I don't understand what that means.
So I, as a parent, you can, if I moved in and you tell me my child has been identified as an English learner, I could say, I don't want them enrolled in that program.
I
And
see.
they won't get any of the services, but we still have to give them the federally mandated assessment every year. They would still have to take that test.
I see.
So are we, if you've said this already, I apologize. Are we not in compliance in one language, Spanish in Vernon Hills, or is it more than one language?
Right, it's the Spanish speaking population that triggered that, yeah.
What distinguishes TBE part-time from TBE full-time?
So there's a test that students are giving when they enroll here, if they didn't participate in that federally mandated assessment. And there are, you get a score for your oral, like oracy, there's a literacy component, there's speaking, listening, reading, and writing component. And so the literacy component is what determines if you're part-time or full-time.
And
So-
then that means there's a certain number of hours per day spent or certain supports in place, or
Yeah, so if you're a full-time student, you have to get your core content areas delivered in your native language. And what many districts will do is they have a TBE program and then they will start to teach what's called sheltered language instruction, and they begin to kind of scaffold away from the native language and slowly integrate the English till they transition to a part-time where the majority of their day is in English and the native language supports are provided as needed so that they can successfully transition into the general education classroom.
But that typically happen over one school year or 2 school years, or it just depends?
So a really great program, if you were looking at the elementary level, it will take about 7 to 9 years for that transition to happen.
I see.
So we're a high school district, so I think we have some, I think Hawthorne has a dual program, so we have kids coming to us that are already ELs, and so we have some that are what we call long-term ELs who will probably never exit the program. But I do think that we have a good foundation at our feeder schools to be able to successfully transition students here. And that is, when you look at our state report card, we have a very, we have a great success rate in transitioning students from the EL status to the gen ed classroom. That is something that we do well.
so can you just explain the discrepancy as to why we went from 0 last year to 17 this year for full-time TBE?
I think we didn't have the number of newcomers last year that we have had this year. We're at 25. And the majority of them have been in Spanish and a good number of them, most of them from Colombia, as I was looking at the data, which I think is really interesting.
Very interesting.
And
So just a large influx of these students from a certain geographical area. Okay, thank you.
Next slide, yeah. And so here are the, I think are the immediate needs. I think we need to identify a way of develop a staffing plan. And I think it needs to be a multi-year staffing plan, like, okay, this is because it is not easy to find content area teachers that are also fluent in the language and have the bilingual endorsement. So many districts will develop a multi-year staffing plan. And so say this year, we're going to focus on finding, if we're going to have a math teacher retiring, we're really going to try our very best to hire or have someone replace that person that does have the bilingual endorsement. And the next one is figuring out what that administrator oversight piece looks like, because right now we have our world languages department chair oversees the work at Vernon Hills, and the person who oversees the work here falls in the English department. But they also have to do all of the duties that come with their current role. And so knowing that once we hit 200 students, ISB is going to require that we designate an administrator to see it Is it, do we start considering what a part-time administrator would look like and how we structure that, or looking at our current staffing and kind of developing as part of the whole program, developing a in-depth staffing plan that looks at the teacher needs that we have, as well as that administrator need that we know is coming.
When
So
you say that
question-
we have, oh, I'm sorry. When you say that we have to start thinking about content area bilingual teachers, are we talking about at every grade level as well? So not only are we each content area, but one for 9, 10, 11, and 12?
Well, for example, if you're a science teacher, we might need to have a life science and a physical science person who could teach, both math would be probably one of the math and English would be simplest because you can teach any of the content areas. Not that we would want one math teacher having to teach 4 or 5 different courses, but for some of the disciplines where the certification is very specific, it might mean more than one person in that department, but for some departments, having one person would meet the needs of our students as, again, our program continues to grow.
But the staffing plan would identify this.
Yeah, because there are districts that will say, okay, we don't have enough students to have one teacher per grade level. So for this content area, we're going to bring 2 grade levels together, and then the teacher kind of has to manage.
Sure. And we have a lot of teachers that might have a freshman or sophomore in their class, or a junior or a senior. We don't have that many classes that are specific to.
It would be
class.
more though where you're teaching 2 different curriculums. So if you had freshman and sophomore English, we do have that right now in some of our world language programs, and we have it in some of our capstone programs in CTE, where we only have 4 students who are requesting this and 8 students who are requesting this. And rather than canceling it, we sometimes cluster those courses. So we do have right now some sections of classes that are what we call combo classes. That is one way that other districts also approach this, is by having some combo classes where more than one curriculum is being taught in the same, by the same teacher, but 2 different groups of students in the same classroom.
It sounds onerous.
Yes, it is.
So my question is, we've passed the threshold of 20 in the Spanish speaking population. Is there any risk that any other language
We're 13 students away in Russian.
in Russia, 13, okay. And has that been more stable? Where's most of the growth, I guess, is the
In the Spanish.
yeah. So it's less likely that that's going to happen anytime in the next couple of years to pass that threshold in Russian or Ukrainian or any other language. It's really the Spanish language.
Yeah, that's
need
been the
right now.
majority of our newcomers.
It could happen very quickly in any language area though, and when we
Yeah,
look
if you
at-
had
yeah,
all of a sudden an influx into the community. of
any-
a particular-
global upheaval could kind of signal a change for us.
Yeah,
So yeah, certainly something to just kind of always keep top of mind, but
And again, I think some of the analogies you made previously to thinking of this as a service that's analogous to students with IEPs. So if we have some students move in who have some very significant needs, we don't have a choice but to find the resources to meet those needs. So it's for EL, it's a language need rather than maybe some other academic or social emotional need that's being addressed. But just how each year we say, what are our special education needs, and we adjust our staffing and do those things. We're just seeing this program blossom quite a bit. So just how Kelly and her team do a good job of trying to predict where are we seeing growth, working with the middle schools, doing all of that to make sure that our special education staffing is meeting the needs. We're going to be in that analogous situation here for EL. And so just like we have a special ed director, the state knows that we are going to soon need an EL director for many of the same kinds of responsibilities. And I think our total enrollment right now is 120. And the requirement for a full-time person is 200. So what we're trying to prepare you for is what might that look like, and not to go from 0 to 100, but to say in this next year, would it make sense to have a half-time person? So that we are getting some of our So we're consolidating again, because right now it's being delivered separately at both schools. And there's not one person in the district who necessarily is overseeing, other than Yesenia, who has lots of other things to do, who's overseeing the program.
Yeah, and I think Tammy Black over at Vernon Hills is doing a tremendous job and, you know, the Illinois State Board of Education has an exchange with Spain where you can hire teachers from Spain and they come over for 3 years. And so kind of pitched, oh, you know, Tammy, is this something we want to consider? And she was very gracious and said, I have a lot to deal with all the newcomers and trying to figure out how to best service the needs. Right now, I just don't have the capacity to start thinking about that at the moment. Because I think in one of our classes at Vernon Hills, the 8th period, we have, I think it's 18 or 19 students in that 8th period. 18 students in that 8th period, and they are, the gamut of the language is all over the place, and it's kids from multiple languages, so it's really hard for the teachers to really meet them where they're at and make sure each of them.
I
get
do
what they
want
need.
to, you know, as we're painting this story of the challenges we're facing, I do want to remind the board also that we have added staffing to our EL program. Last fall, we added another section of teacher time. And in the fall, we also added 2 more part-time English language or EL assistants. So they could supervise some of the needs that we see here. So we've been using our contingency and other things to meet some of the growing needs. We felt we need to bring it to you because we see some big program adjustments that are going to call for more investment than just a section or 2 here or there. So we wanted to make sure we've been keeping up with the small changes within the current budget. But for next year's budget, we're going to need to make greater investments in the EL services.
From a funding or financial standpoint, is there like a number of students at which point we can start receiving more grants or funding from the state?
There is, and I don't have that number off the top of my head. I did talk to our principal consultant at ISB at the beginning of the year when I was trying to submit the application and I couldn't. And I was like, saying, why don't I have access to this application? And we just don't, our enrollment hasn't triggered it yet.
Can I ask?
But I gotta be honest, even if our enrollment did, there are formulas.
Yeah.
To make sure that the money goes to districts less fortunate than us. So I don't foresee any real scenario that there's going to be any serious funding for a program like this, just to be clear.
Can I ask one more question, just a point of clarification on outplaced ELs? So outplaced means what I would assume it's not attending school on site in one of our 2 buildings. Is that
Right.
correct?
So we have some special needs EL students who are outplaced.
Placed through CEDAW most likely? Okay,
Could be private.
okay, thank you. 3 buildings. We get to say 3 buildings now.
That's right.
I'm sorry. We have 3 buildings.
So I'm going to start working with the building leaders and the teachers at the schools to bring forth a staffing plan, multi-year staffing plan, so that we can start thinking about this. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to thank you especially for this. This is like extremely eye-opening. Thank goodness you're pointing this out to us. I think it really speaks to how, well, not that there's a blind spot at all, but that as board members, we don't get to see everything. We just don't know always the needs and the issues that exist. And this was just so comprehensive and demonstrative of really what we're looking at and kind of, the challenge we're facing with our EL students, and what we can do best to support their needs. And so I really appreciate you putting this together and furnishing all this information.
And I would say thank you to all the teachers and staff members who are having to deal with this situation, so.
Vicky's here, so we can give her a big round.
Thank you, Vic.
Well, I think there are lots of challenges, but having visited this program several times this fall, the teachers also receive so many blessings from working with these students also. So yes, there are language barriers, and yes, there are challenges to delivering curriculum to such a wide range of learners. But they are magical students, and I know from talking with several teachers that it's a bright spot in their day when they get to work with students in this learner category.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else comments or anything? Okay, back to the agenda. Future agenda items. Got a couple there, administrative staff contract renewals and textbook adoption coming up in April. Got a whole list of things in March. Employment recommendations, that kind of thing. In February, board policies, that'll be our second reading for the ones we went through tonight, but that's about it. Anything else we're missing? Just as an FYI. Okay.
And then for the January 24th board meeting, we will have prepared information to answer the board questions about the CCRI position so that you feel more informed to consider that at the next board meeting.
Okay. Anything else for the good? Okay, we will adjourn the Program and Personnel Committee meeting at 7:56.
Do we need a bio break before we start? Half enough?
Yes.
Yeah. 5 minutes.
Get up and stretch.
Run.
Program and Personnel Committee meeting adjourned. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next. Currently on break. Facilities and Finance Committee meeting up next.
Here we go. All right, let's call to order the Facilities and Finance Committee meeting for Monday, January 9th. It is 8:03 p.m. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to offer public comment? No? Okay, no other public comment? All right. Moving on for discussion, we have capital projects, enrollment projections, and disposal of equipment, starting with summer 2023 capital projects. Quite a list. I think we all are.
So what we have before you is our summer capital projects list. So there are two attachments that were attached. One is the list with some information. The other one is, I think a really cool thing that John Heron in our business office helped put together, to get an aerial view, to get an idea of what's happening where. And you can see stuff happening all over the place. And there usually is stuff happening all over the place. We just never really put it on a picture for you.
I appreciate that. I
I
haven't
liked
seen
it.
that before.
Yeah,
I really,
I love.
I'm a visual learner, so this is very helpful. For me.
Please thank him for us.
Yes.
For sure. So essentially we have a list of the projects and some data associated with them. So there's the list of the project is on the first column, and then we have them categorized into the three categories that we've been kind of working under: health and safety, asset preservation, and then other. Asset preservation is going to be usually where we spend most of our money because we have a lot of assets here that we need to maintain and replace, end of life, things like that. Then what we did was kind of put a priority to it. And nothing really magical here, other than I would say primarily Mark's sense of things that we need to do, things we should do, and things that can wait. Because like we've talked before, there's only so much money. And so we're trying to be mindful of all of those things. So one of the things we've talked about before was what didn't get on this list, right? So that's been a question, like what was kind of toyed around but then didn't get on this list. What's not on the list is on here, but there's just no dollar amount attached to it, but there's a note to let you know kind of where that was. The next column is more specific description. So for instance, the first one is asbestos abatement, but really the more description is it's the asbestos abatement associated with the water fountain replacements and the washroom remodel. So that's a different contractor that has to do those things. And so that's what that is. If we have the information on the last year, something was replaced, or the last time, we put it in, we did that. Some of those are a little bit difficult to find out. And it was kind of funny to hear, I heard Mark and Brian were kind of looking back in some yearbooks to find when certain things were there, because one year it was not there and the next year it's in the pictures. So, so some of that is a little bit hard to find out exactly when something was originally there. Then what we wanted to do is provide a brief statement about why are we looking at something like this. The health and safety ones are usually pretty straightforward. A lot of asset preservation stuff is going to be related to end of life. And then there's just some notes to give you an idea. So you might see contractor plus STR. So that's usually the cost of a contractor that's going to come in, a trade, but then there's also a design cost. And those are usually around 7%-ish, depending on what you're doing. So we have Inspect that largely does our building envelope. So that's going to be the outsides of the buildings, the roofs. Architect handles a lot of the inside of the buildings. And then we have the location. Sorry, LOC is for location and the estimated costs associated with those. So we have the list of each of those projects. And then if you kind of scroll down, what we did is provide a summary of two different ways of looking at it. Because there's different ways of looking at anything. One is we decided to write I put together a summary of categories. So health and safety, what are the must-dos, the should-dos, the can-waits in there. And for health and safety, there's no should-dos or can-waits. They're all must-dos. So that total is listed for you there. We're on the second page of the list. The second category is asset preservation. So you can see the totals for what's the must-dos versus should-dos. And again, no can-waits on asset preservations. And then other projects, must-do, should-do, and can-waits. And so you see the total there. And then the next one is categorized summarized by priority. So it's prioritized by the must-dos with each category, then the should-dos by each category, and the can-waits by each category. The can-waits they're all zeroed out, so that's why the zeros are there, but the numbers for what we were estimating for those are included in the item column. So right now we're sitting at an estimate of about 4 million, which is a little bit higher than where we're at this year. And then let me see if there's something else that I wanted to mention briefly. So you can see the aerials that show where the parking lots are, the hardscapes, kind of the location of all those different areas. I don't think I need to explain more about what that is. But yeah, this is the list of projects. One thing I do want to be clear on. I mentioned it at the last meeting, but I would just want to make crystal clear again. We are still working on the prioritization process that would include all of the remodels that we're interested in doing. We're still working on that. That's not really part of this. This is part of we got to keep moving. That other process is just taking longer than I thought it would. But we need to move forward on summer projects. And so really, that other process will help inform our future projects that we're looking on that aren't necessarily tied to summer. There's a lot of projects that have been talked about or proposed or discussed that are not summer projects. We've talked about the cafeteria here before, that you can't do that in the summer. That's going to take a couple of years to renovate that cafeteria. So there's a lot of projects that aren't confined to a summer. These are the projects that are confined to the summer. And then in terms of how do projects really get on this list, they're going to start with really our long-term capital plan in terms of like where are our assets and where is the timing of those. And then Mark will basically do an analysis of what can we do right now. So for instance, there's a number of HVAC things that aren't on this list that we would have originally probably put on there, but we can't get the equipment. You're going to wait a year to get the equipment. So we can't, even if we ordered it right now, we wouldn't be able to get it in time for summer. So some of the lead times have significantly impacted like the specifics of what's on this list. And just anytime you have a plan, kind of back to the comment that Jim made about the action plans, right? We have objectives, but sometimes those tasks can shift depending on what's happening. That's happened with some of these projects. So for example, the chiller, originally we didn't anticipate the chiller would be for this summer at this building. We would plan that it'd be a little bit later, but since last year, the chiller has been failing and it's showing its age and it needs to get replaced sooner than later because we're running out of the ability to repair that at a reasonable rate, if that makes sense. So those are a lot of the things that go into what gets on this list. Mark, anything?
Yeah, another example, again, is the remodel of the two washrooms. The remodeling of the two washrooms. We had on the long-term capital list to have the bleachers be ADA compliant here at the stadium at
The visitor bleachers.
the visitor bleachers at Libertyville. Well, we've done some work in these washrooms a few years ago, and now the problem is come about again, where we're getting a sewer gas smell. So we've got deteriorated pipes that we can't find. So we need to find it to solve the problem. So, you know, that bumped that project, the other project, lower priority because, you know, it's a health and life safety here on this one. So, Vernon Hills, we had in the long-term capital plan, the roofs are placed in a certain order. Well, I analyzed where we were at. We're doing roof number 16. That's the one we've had the most leak repairs in the last 2 years. So we bumped that to the top of the list because that's the roof that's failing the most at this time. So all those things are taken into consideration when it comes to the items that go onto the list and try to stay within our budget as close to we were to last year.
How close is this one to last year? You said it was close. How close?
We're at 3.7, 3.8 this last year. So this is sitting at 4 right now. So we intentionally like add more because of, inflation, right? So we usually kind of adjust that by a certain amount. We've been working on that the last couple of years. So this is probably a bit more than that, but also some of these are like smaller numbers and it's hard to know where numbers will come in. You could have some numbers come in less. We had it last year where some numbers came in a whole lot higher. So that's why we have some of these should do's that should the must do's come in higher, the should do's are going to have to be weights.
And in terms of what you need from us to move forward to go out to bid, what are you looking for from this conversation?
The biggest thing of what I'm looking for is informed, that you're informed of the list that we're looking for, that you're comfortable with the list that we have, because a few of these, we would intend to bring back some of the things that are co-op that we can order now. We would bring it back in January to get them ordered now, so that we'll have them in time for summer, which we've had that song and dance a few times with a few projects now, bringing things a little bit or sooner than we would have otherwise. But just with lead times and everything like that.
This sort of is intended to answer the question that we will have in 3 months when we go to approve one of these bids. How does this fit into the big picture? And so this is sort of the big picture of what.
Yeah, I appreciate the level of detail on this, and particularly the last year replaced. That's eye-opening in some cases, and it really speaks to the need to continually maintain our assets, and the fact that, you know, we spend money on maintaining our buildings every summer, but this is a very clear way of looking at why we have to do those things and why certain things you know, fall farther up the priority list. So I appreciate the level of detail you guys provided on this. I have one little question. When it talks about the asbestos abatement with the water fountains, I see that the abatement obviously is a must do, but then water fountain replacement is a should do. Are those costs separate, or would that be one or the other? Does that make sense?
So, well, we would, whatever asbestos abatement we're doing, we would do it all together at once, because
Okay,
one company is going to come in here and do the asbestos abatement. That was a tricky one, because we did just combine it together. So the scope of what they're going to abate will change depending on what and how many fountains we actually do. If we do 0, it'll be smaller. If we do the washrooms are down as a must do, so we're definitely going to have it for the washrooms. The question is, and the abatement behind the water fountains can't be that much.
Yeah, and usually it's just elbows, and things like that. So when we bid it out, we will bid it for additional elbows that can be done. We can legally do under 3 lineal feet of abatement in an area, which the water fountains would end up being that. But there's still some containment and stuff. They call it a glove bag method. So that would be included in the abatement for these washrooms. We would have a line item for any additional unforeseen conditions. You know, we found another valve out in the hallway we needed to do.
okay.
As well as, you know, use it for water fountains.
So there might be some economies of scale savings in doing all of those together. Okay. Any other questions?
I'm very comfortable with this list.
Yeah.
Health and safety and asset preservation are essential.
Can't argue with it.
So I can bring you up to speed where we are right now. So we've already working on roof number 16. We will be going out with bid notice here end of this week. We'll be bringing it to F&F in February for that, for February completion. We're finalizing Cougar Way with that work also, so that I'm anticipating a February board approval. I have we're finalizing the prices for the chiller project at Libertyville High School. And we'll have that for this month. That's the co-op pricing, as well as finalizing the and I'm losing my place. The Vernon Hills High School baseball infield, because that product last year, they were sold out by March. So that's another one, getting the final numbers from them in the final contract for the co-op pricing on that. And I can also possibly have the weight room flooring this month also to lock in those co-op pricing. And then obviously we're working forward with, then we'll put the bid packages together for the abatement, seal coating and all the other projects. And we're in the development of the washroom remodel, and I hope to have a bid, have it on the street here end of January, beginning of February. So that might be a March approval. At this point, I'm not quite sure.
When it comes to the chiller replacement, I see that it's not on the list for this summer. Are we gonna cross our fingers and hope that it can make
Well-
it till next summer or?
So there's the Vernon Hills chiller and the LHS chiller. The LHS chiller is on for this summer.
Okay,
The Vernon Hills one, we held off
we're gonna hold off on. Okay.
until next.
And actually with the chiller, with the lead times, actually, the work won't take place over the summer. The equipment won't be here till fall, but
Okay.
the demo and all that equipment will be replaced over the winter
When you don't use the chiller.
when you're not using the chiller, so we don't shut down in the summer. If we have to shut down, there's considerable amount of time, which we did, we ran into when we did Vernon Hills with the construction. And, the rest of the building suffered, not be able to run that chiller for I think it was 6 or 7 weeks. We saved a lot of money on electricity, but
But I heard
was not
about
a very
it from my
pleasant place to
son
work.
every day.
Hard way. Okay. All right, any other questions or comments? All right, moving on. Fiscal year 2024 enrollment projections.
I have for you, what I've been kind of calling the core enrollment. So this is just looking at the students in our two big high school buildings. So this won't include like transition pathways or anything like that. It's just kind of looking at those enrollments. So there's a written report there. I won't recite the whole thing, just really to say, to really know what's going to happen in these buildings, we have to look at what's happening in our feeders. So I spent a lot of time analyzing what's happening in each of our feeders. And then I even project the enrollment in our feeders because eventually those students come here, or a significant portion of those students come here. And so there's information about what's happening in each of the feeders. I think one takeaway, especially even from the Casarda report that we did last year or the year before, year and a half ago-ish, was enrollment trending downwards, but in terms of why, particularly at Vernon Hills, the reason why is because people are not migrating out, meaning empty nesters are not downsizing. Typically, the typical cycle, move in, big house, family, empty nester, downsize. That has not been happening in Vernon Hills, but Casarda was very clear, it's going to happen. Like it's going to happen, it's just not happening yet.
Yeah.
So, it might happen in 10 years, or you might start to happen. So, this is not you can see it go down and it's going to stay down. It's not, it's going to go back up, but the idea is that it doesn't seem foreseeable in the next 5 years, for example. You're talking, these are like 20, 30-year cycles that we're talking about. So, that's really what's happening primarily in Vernon Hills area. But in terms of so that's really what's happening at a big picture level. The direct impact based on the analysis next year is that on average, our enrollment will go down at each building about 1.1 and 1.2%, depending on the building. So that's not a very big change, but they're both projected to go down. The bigger change will be the year after next, that we're anticipating. So these numbers impact our staffing process that we're going to go through. It'll impact budgeting, both on the revenue and expenditure side, because if you have less students, you're going to have less school fees that are generated, right, from less students. So there's a lot of things that the students that are here is the biggest driver of all of our functions as a
All of
system.
our expenses.
Yeah, I was trying to, yeah, you're right. It is the biggest driver. So, and the needs of those students. So that's just an idea of the core enrollment projections for our system. There's another level of projections that I guess just to let you know that I'm working on. And this is related to even our equity action plan in terms of allocating resources equitably. I've been starting to look at enrollment projections for our EL, low income, and students with special needs. And kind of creating really a whole projection for each of those groups. Because what I've seen is you can see a population move from kindergarten on all the way through to us. You're gonna have migration's gonna happen, people are gonna move and move up, but you can see a group of students move. So if I know, for example, at one of our schools, they've got a bubble at a 5th grade, you can see when they were kindergartners, and you can see that they're gonna trend down. So I'm really working on creating, but it's like a whole thing to go through these projections. So it's really kind of doing like 4 projections. So I'm working on that to get a sense of where do we see our EL going in the next 5 years. Same with low income students as well. So because that's an area that we've always been trying to find better ways to serve those students. And so, yeah, so that's going to be coming. That's not something that I could prepare right now because I've never done it. I've never done that before. So I have to kind of start from ground zero, and I have all the data. I just need to kind of sit there and crunch it and analyze it. So,
So is one of the many benefits of doing that is knowing what's coming, but among the benefits is it's possible that our enrollment could decrease slightly, but our cost per student will either stay the same or go up.
yeah, like you could have a decrease in total student enrollment, but if you have a significant increase in your EL student population, that will more than offset any other kind of, looking at just core enrollment is a little too simple.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what I'm finding. It's helpful and it impacts a lot of things they're doing, but we need to get more nuanced, especially if the way we allocate resources, if we're looking at how we're doing that based on the students that are here or the students that we're expecting to come, we need to look at those other categories, because that's exactly what the state does when they do their evidence-based funding calculations. And when they figure out what's adequate for schools, they look at core enrollments, EL enrollment, low-income enrollment, special ed enrollment. And so I feel that's appropriate for us to look at too. But we're not there yet, but that's where we're heading.
And for us, for this district, declining enrollment doesn't necessarily mean declining revenue.
No, because we're beyond the points where we're at the minimum funding level essentially. So any less students we get, we're not going to get less money, but any more students we get, we're not really going to get more money.
Mm-hmm.
So we're in this period of, we're going to get what we're going to get from the states. And that's largely not going to change.
Mm-hmm.
The significant change in our revenue is going to come from property taxes.
Mm-hmm.
So enrollment trending down, next year down 1.1-ish%.
It'll be interesting to see when you parse out some of those other details, what that shows us. Any other comments or questions? Okay, thank you, Dan. Appreciate that. Excuse me, moving on to disposal of equipment. Looks like we've decided to hang on to a piece of equipment.
Yeah, we want to take back that disposal we did in December. We want to keep on that van for a little bit longer. So we're going to undo the disposal that we did in December.
We are okay
Our
with
bad. We're not ready to get rid of that.
Hey, my mom's driving a 2006 one. It's all good.
We'll trade her because the used market is not great. So
Do we have to take formal action to undo previous action?
we are, because an accounting thing, like we approved it, and so it's asset tracked and everything like that. And so I want to formally do that. So I have the right accounting of it.
So sorry, we don't want to back.
Yeah. If we don't know,
Do we have to buy it back?
Nope. Nope.
All good questions. Okay, so we will be voting on that in 2 weeks. Okay, that's about it on the list. Future agenda items.
Yeah, so
Oh.
No, so later this month, we'll have some of the capital project stuff with, so that wasn't on this list. And then, I was trying to have a mid-year financial review for today, but just couldn't put it all together, pull it all together. December was like 9 days ago. It's really hard to analyze what happened 9 days ago. But I'll have it for the January. I think I'll have it for the January board meeting. What's coming in February is our long-term financial projections. So I should have our final financial reports tomorrow, maybe, or the day after, and then I can start calculating long-term financial projections. And then that'll be so then next month we'll have our annual comprehensive financial report. So those are the big things coming.
Okay. Great. That's it for the list. So this adjourns F and F at 8:30.